In today's video, we'll be exploring the origins of one of the most powerful slogans in American history: no taxation without representation. This rallying cry didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the result of a series of British policies that challenged colonial self-government and ignited resistance from Massachusetts all the way to Georgia. From new taxes and enforced trade regulations to widespread protest and even acts of defiance like the Boston Tea Party, the American colonists found themselves increasingly at odds with British authority. In today's video, we'll walk through the major phases that transformed frustration into organized resistance and set the stage for the American Revolution. Let's get started. Following the 7 Years' War, also known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, Britain found itself deep in debt. To maintain and protect its growing empire, especially in North America, the British government decided it needed to collect more revenue from its American colonies. To the British, this made perfect sense. They were defending the colonies, so the colonists should help pay the cost. But to many American colonists, this was a threat to their liberties. They believed in the long standing English tradition that taxes should only be imposed with the consent of the people. And since they had no representatives in Parliament, they argued that only their own colonial assemblies had the authority to tax them. But the British disagreed. They claimed that colonists were virtually represented, that Parliament represented all British subjects, whether they voted or not. But to the colonists, this idea of virtual representation, it just simply rang hollow. The two sides were now operating on fundamentally different ideas of what representation meant. This disagreement would become the wedge that drove the colonies further and further from the British crown. In the years just after the 7 Years' War, King George III's Treasury Chief, Lord George Granville, pushed through a trio of acts in Parliament that ignited colonial outrage. First, the Sugar Act of 1764 placed new duties on foreign sugar and certain luxury goods. At the same time, the Revenue Act of 1763 strictly enforced the Navigation Acts and created new rules for prosecuting smugglers without juries. Second, the Quartering Act of 1765 required colonists to provide food and lodging for British soldiers stationed in America. And lastly, and most significant of all, was the Stamp Act of 1765. It required colonists to buy and use special revenue stamps on nearly everything that was printed: newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. This Stamp Act was especially inflammatory because it was a direct tax. Unlike earlier trade taxes paid by merchants, this one came straight from the pockets of everyday colonists. The backlash was immediate and widespread. Every colony and nearly every social class objected. Delegates from 9 colonies met at the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in October of 1765. It was the first significant act of intercolonial unity since the Albany Congress in 1754. The Congress issued the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, arguing that only elected colonial legislatures had the right to tax them. Outside official channels, resistance turned radical. Groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty organized protests, hung effigies of tax collectors, and even destroyed the mansion of Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor. But perhaps the most effective protest was the boycott. Colonists, especially women, began weaving their own cloth instead of buying British imports. British merchants, feeling the economic pinch, pushed Parliament to act. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but at the same time, they passed the Declaratory Act, declaring that Parliament still had the authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. The British weren't backing down. The British still needed money. So in 1767, the new Chancellor Charles Townshend introduced the Townshend Acts, new duties on imports like tea, glass, paper, and paint. What made these taxes especially controversial was that the money raised would pay royal officials in the colonies, stripping colonial assemblies of their financial power over those officials. Worse, these laws allowed customs officials to search private homes using writs of assistance, general warrants that required no judge's approval. Colonists once again protested with boycotts and petitions. Tensions escalated in cities like Boston. On March 5th, 1770, a crowd of colonists harassed British soldiers in Boston with snowballs, rocks, and insults. The soldiers opened fire, killing 5 people, including Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent. This event would become known as the Boston Massacre, a rallying point for anti British sentiment. Just a month later, in April 1770, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, but it kept the tea tax. The gesture wasn't enough. Suspicion of British motives only continued to grow stronger. After a brief lull in the early 1770s, tensions exploded again with the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. This law gave the British East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. While the tea was cheaper than before, colonists saw the move as a sneaky way to force them to accept taxation without representation. American merchants especially hated the Tea Act because it cut them out of the tea trade entirely. Across the colonies, boycotts and protests erupted. Again, women played a major role. In some ports, ships carrying tea were turned away, but in Boston, resistance took a more dramatic form. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Other cities like Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York held their own tea parties in solidarity. The British government responded with a heavy hand. In 1774, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, meant to punish Massachusetts and to reassert control. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act and Administration of Justice Act suspended self government and allowed British officials to avoid colonial courts. And a new quartering act required colonists to house British soldiers. Again, rather than intimidating the colonies into submission, these actions only fueled further resistance and unity among the colonists. By 1774, the issues of taxation without representation had grown into a broader conflict about power, rights, and liberty. The colonists believed their rights as Englishmen were being violated. The British believed they were simply governing their empire. But the divide between these two worldviews, especially around the meaning of representation, had become unbridgeable. These events, from the Stamp Act protests to the Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts, weren't just isolated incidents. They were chapters in a growing story of colonial resistance, identity, and the pursuit of self rule. The American Revolution was no longer unthinkable. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.